All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of our listeners are dealing with right now:
And that is,
complexity,
mm,
especially in the business world. But you know what? This isn't going to be just another episode about how, everything is so complex these days.
right, right. Because we all know that already.
Exactly. We want to go deeper. We're diving into how to actually navigate complexity and maybe even, use it to our advantage.
Now that's interesting. Turn that challenge into an opportunity.
Right. So to help us with this, we're going to be drawing from a really great podcast series called Navigating Complexity. It's by Haptic R&D Consulting. Have you had a chance to check it out?
Oh, yeah. I've been listening to it. They've got some seriously smart people talking about this stuff.
Hmm.
What I really appreciate is how they go beyond just saying, things are complex and actually give you tools and strategies to deal with it.
Totally.
Hmm.
That's exactly what we're aiming for in this deep dive as well. It's one thing to know there's a tangled mess out there, but we need to figure out how to untangle it.
I like that analogy.
So before we get into the how-to, let's start with the basics. When we say complexity in business, what are we really talking about?
Well, the first episode of Navigating Complexity does a great job of breaking this down.
Hmm.
They talk about it as interconnected systems. Systems that are constantly changing. And then you've got this just overwhelming amount of information coming at you from all directions.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds pretty overwhelming already. Is there a way to make this feel a little less abstract? Some kind of analogy?
They actually use a great one in the podcast. They compare it to, imagine a giant ball of yarn. You know how if you pull on one thread, it can totally mess up the whole thing.
Oh, yeah, totally. That's a good visual.
That's complexity. Every action, even a small one, can have these ripple effects that you might not even see coming. It's all connected.
Yikes. I can definitely relate to that feeling. Feeling like I'm just pulling on one thread and hoping for the best, but who knows what's going to happen. So where does this yarn ball, as you called it, actually show up in the business world? What are some real-world examples?
Well, just looking at the episode titles of the podcast, it gives you a sense of how broad this really is. So
Yeah.
episode 2, for example, they dive into how markets are constantly shifting. It's like trying to hit a moving target, but the target's getting faster all the time.
Oh, tell me about it. It seems like trends come and go in the blink of an eye these days. Seriously, trying to plan anything feels almost impossible.
Yeah, and then you've got technology. It's like a double-edged sword,
Yeah.
Episode 3 of the podcast unpacks this. They talk about how tools like AI can help manage all that information we were just talking about. But at the same time, they also add like a whole new layer of things to figure out.
Right. It's like AI is incredible, but it also creates a whole bunch of new challenges, questions we haven't even thought of yet. It's like a whole other ball of yarn.
Exactly. And then, of course, you can't forget about those internal struggles that most companies face, like, those dreaded silos, different departments not talking to each other.
Ugh, the silos.
Episode 4 is all about that, how those silos can make absolutely everything harder.
Oh, I think we've all been there, right? The frustration of trying to get things done when teams just aren't on the same page, like they're speaking completely different languages.
And the podcast really drives this point home, that silos aren't just a communication problem. They actually make it way harder to adapt to change because information is getting trapped. It's like everyone's, I don't know, it's like trying to steer a ship where everyone on board is rowing in a different direction.
Wow, that's a recipe for disaster. Okay, so we've established that complexity is everywhere. External market forces, our own internal structures, technology that's both helping and hindering us. But the real question is, what do we do about it?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the good news is navigating complexity doesn't just leave us hanging with this feeling of impending doom.
Okay, good. Because I was starting to feel a little overwhelmed.
They actually offer a whole bunch of strategies for, well, navigating complexity. And a lot of it starts with, shifting your mindset.
Oh, interesting. So it's an inside job first.
In a way, yeah. Episode 2, for instance, they talk about the importance of adaptability, being agile, responsive to change. They have this great analogy they compare it to, like, a martial artist. You know how they can kind of flow with their opponent's moves instead of getting stuck in one rigid stance.
I like that. Being flexible, ready to adjust on the fly. But how do you actually, translate that to a business setting? It's not like we can all suddenly become kung fu masters.
Right, right. It's more about being proactive, anticipating change, rather than just reacting to it when it hits you. The podcast suggests using something called horizon scanning. Basically, it means you're always looking out for, like, trends, signals, anything that might impact your business down the line.
So it's like being aware of what's happening around you and being prepared to, pivot when you need to.
Exactly. Always scanning the horizon for potential storms or, maybe even some smooth sailing ahead.
That makes sense. But how do you actually make decisions when there's so much uncertainty? It feels like you could analyze things forever and still not know the right answer.
Oh, I feel that. Analysis paralysis is a real thing, especially in complex situations. That's why episode 5 of the podcast tackles decision-making head on.
Oh, good. What's their secret?
Well, the key takeaway for me was that you need frameworks to guide you. Frameworks that help you analyze the situation, consider different perspectives, and try to anticipate the consequences of your choices, even when things are constantly in flux.
Framework. So it's not just about winging it and hoping for the best.
Definitely not. One framework they talk about is scenario planning. You create these hypothetical what-if situations, basically. You're testing your strategies against all these different potential futures. It's like wargaming for your business.
That's actually kind of cool. So it's about preparing for multiple possibilities instead of assuming you know exactly how things are going to play out.
Exactly. And speaking of choices, the podcast also emphasizes this idea of not relying solely on data when you're making those decisions.
Wait, what? Isn't data supposed to be like the holy grail of decision making these days?
Well, that's where experience and wisdom come in, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes your intuition can pick up on things that the data might miss. It's about knowing when to trust the numbers and when to trust your gut.
Okay, so it's about finding that balance. Data and intuition.
Exactly. And, on that note, we can't forget about risk.
Oh, yeah. That's the other side of the complexity coin, isn't it? All this change, all this uncertainty. It feels like there are landmines everywhere.
You're right to bring that up, and the Navigating Complexity folks tackle that head on in episode 7. It's not about being reckless, obviously,
Mm.
but they make a really good point that you can't avoid risk altogether, because then you'd never try anything new, you'd never innovate.
Makes sense. If you're not taking any risks, you're probably not growing either.
Right. So they talk about managing risk intelligently, using tools to assess and mitigate it.
Okay, so what kind of tools are we talking about here?
Well, they suggest using things like risk assessment matrices.
Yeah.
Those help you weigh the potential impact of a risk against the likelihood of it actually happening. And they also bring up scenario planning again, which we just talked about. By thinking through those different potential futures, you can spot potential risks early on and start developing plans to minimize the damage if they do happen.
So it's more about being prepared, not necessarily paranoid.
Exactly. Preparation is key in a complex environment. And, this brings us to another really crucial element, leadership.
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking, with all this talk about adaptability, decision-making, risk management, it sounds like you need a very particular kind of leader to, guide a team through all of this.
That's exactly where episode 8 of the podcast comes in. It's all about leadership in the context of complexity. And they argue that these leaders need to be, well, first of all, they need to be comfortable with ambiguity. They can't freak out when things aren't clear-cut.
Right, because in a complex world, there are rarely easy answers.
Exactly. And they also need to be really good at empowering their teams, creating a culture where it's safe to experiment, to even fail sometimes, because that's how you learn and grow.
It sounds like leading in this kind of world requires a completely different playbook than what might have worked in the past.
Totally. And, this is where things get really interesting, because this complexity isn't going away anytime soon. In fact, episode 9 dives into the future of complexity management. And I've got to say, some of the stuff they talk about is pretty mind-blowing.
Okay, I am intrigued now. None of us have a crystal ball, but what do the experts think is coming down the pike? And more importantly, what can we do to prepare ourselves for whatever the future holds?
Well, it's not like they give you a neat little list of predictions.
Hmm.
It's more about, how do I put it? They frame the future of complexity management as this ongoing process. You're constantly learning, adapting, collaborating.
So instead of trying to predict the unpredictable, we should be focusing on building our capacity to just navigate whatever comes our way.
Exactly. Developing that mindset that embraces change, uncertainty, and the need for continuous learning.
So it's almost like becoming comfortable with being uncomfortable.
In a way, yeah. It's about cultivating those skills to analyze complex situations, make decisions when you don't have all the information, and collaborate effectively with others.
Okay, that makes sense. But what does that actually look like in practice? What are some concrete steps we can take to, get ready for this complex future?
Well, one of the most important things you can do is cultivate what's called a growth mindset. I mean, seeing challenges as, as opportunities to learn and grow rather than as threats.
I love that. Reframing challenges as opportunities. It's
Yeah.
about seeing complexity not as a roadblock, but like as a training ground, a place where you can develop resilience and adaptability.
That's a great way to put it. And, we can't talk about the future without talking about technology, specifically things like AI and automation. It feels like those are just going to make everything even more complex.
Right. Like, is it even possible to keep up?
Well, actually, the podcast makes a really interesting argument. They say that technology can be a really powerful tool for managing complexity,
Wait, really? How so?
especially when it comes to dealing with information overload, which is a huge part of complexity. Think about it. AI can process and analyze vast amounts of data that would take humans, forever to sift through.
But it's not about fearing technology. It's about understanding how to use it to our advantage.
Exactly. Staying informed about those emerging technologies and understanding how they can both create and mitigate complexity, it's a delicate dance.
I like that, a delicate dance. So it's about being, what, tech aware and staying curious about how these tools can help us.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, we can't forget about those essential human skills we were talking about earlier. Things like communication, collaboration, critical thinking.
Are those still going to be relevant in a future that's, potentially dominated by AI and automation?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the podcast argues that those human skills will become even more valuable.
Really? Why is that?
Well, think about it. As machines start taking over those more routine tasks, it's our uniquely human abilities that will set us apart. Things like creativity, empathy, that ability to connect with others on a deeper level.
So it's almost like a paradox. The more sophisticated technology gets, the more important those human skills become.
Exactly. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is, but how do we actually like cultivate those skills
Yeah.
in ourselves and in our teams?
That's where the importance of continuous learning comes in. And I don't just mean staying up to date with the latest trends and technologies. It's about actively seeking out opportunities to learn new things, expand your knowledge, challenge your own assumptions.
So becoming lifelong learners, always pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zones.
Exactly. And then, you have to take that learning and translate it into real-world action.
Which is where things can get tricky, right? Because it's one thing to learn about something, but it's another to actually apply it.
Right. And that's where the importance of experimentation comes in, creating environments where it's safe to try new things, to fail fast and learn from those failures. It's about fostering that culture of innovation and agility.
All right, that sounds great in theory. But let's be real. Not everyone's going to be excited about embracing all of this complexity. It's human nature to want things to be predictable, stable.
That's true. Change can be uncomfortable, and complexity definitely brings a lot of change.
So how do we deal with that inevitable resistance that, tends to pop up whenever there's a shift?
Well, the podcast emphasizes the importance of communication, being transparent. You have to explain why the change is necessary, what the potential benefits are, how everyone can contribute.
So it's not just about telling people what to do, it's about helping them understand the why behind it.
Right. And making them feel like they're part of the solution, not just, pawns in some grand scheme.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those people who are just like flat out resistant to change, no matter how well you explain it?
That's where strong leadership is so important. Leaders who can inspire and motivate their teams to embrace change even when it's tough. They do that by creating a shared vision, fostering a culture of trust and respect, empowering individuals to contribute their own unique skills.
So it's about creating an environment where people feel valued and supported, which makes them more willing to step outside of their comfort zones.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the organizational level. What can companies do to create a culture that actually embraces complexity? A culture where people can thrive in the midst of all this change?
That's a great question because it sounds like it takes more than just, a good mission statement and some motivational posters on the wall.
Definitely. It's about leadership, walking the talk, modeling that vulnerability, actively encouraging debate, even dissent, and creating systems and processes that support experimentation and, celebrating both successes and failures as opportunities for learning.
So it's about creating a culture where learning and growth are valued more than just, hitting all the metrics and being perfect all the time.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to take ownership of their work and contribute in their own unique ways.
That sounds amazing. But let's be realistic, not every organization is going to be, ready or willing to embrace this kind of radical change. What advice would you give to someone who's stuck in a more, traditional hierarchical environment?
That's a great question. And it's important to remember that change doesn't happen overnight. It's usually a gradual process. So start small. Build relationships with colleagues in other departments. Break down those silos and look for opportunities to experiment with new ways of working, even within the constraints of your current role.
So being an agent of change from within, even if it's just in small ways.
Exactly. And, all of this stuff we've been talking about, it's not just relevant to our work lives, right? It applies to pretty much every aspect of our lives.
You're right, because complexity is everywhere, whether we like it or not.
And the skills we've been discussing, adaptability, resilience, all that, those are valuable in any context, whether you're navigating, relationships, making decisions about your health, even just trying to make sense of the world around us.
So it's not just about surviving complexity, it's about using it as like a springboard for growth, both personally and professionally.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's a really hopeful message, actually.
It is. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a lot more, I don't know, optimistic about facing complexity head on.
Me too. It's definitely shifted my perspective.
Mine too. And for anyone listening who's feeling, inspired to dive deeper into all of this, I highly recommend checking out the full Navigating Complexity podcast series. They have some really incredible insights and practical strategies.
I second that. It's a must listen for anyone who's serious about, not just surviving, but thriving in a complex world.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question for you, and I hope our listeners will take some time to ponder this as well.
I'm all ears.
What's one area of your work or life where you could benefit from embracing a more complexity-minded approach? Maybe it's a project at work, a personal goal, even a relationship that feels, particularly challenging. Think about how the principles we've discussed today could help you navigate that situation in a more, positive and productive way.
That's a great question to reflect on. And I hope everyone listening will take that challenge to heart. Complexity is all around us, but with the right mindset and tools, we can turn it into an opportunity for growth, innovation, and real change.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay adaptable, and remember, complexity isn't going away. So let's master it.